If your system only works for those who are the loudest, the wealthiest, or look like they belong there, then that's not a system. That's a mirror, and it's time to change what's reflected in that mirror. The entire auditorium stood up, not because of drama, but because of the truth. And at the back of the row, she stood, the woman who had made a 17-year-old boy be removed from business class just because he didn't look like someone who should be sitting there. But that boy didn't leave. He didn't yell. He didn't bang his fists. He just sat still. And that seemingly small act made an entire system listen. This isn't just the story of a first-class ticket. This is the story of determination, of dignity, of standing up by staying right where you belong. Welcome to the story of Elijah Carter, the teenager who made an entire industry change. If you feel that this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to spread these positive values to even more people. Now, let's begin the journey. The flight began like any other. Smooth takeoff, passengers gradually settling into their seats, the hum of the engine weaving through the cabin. But no one expected that just minutes later, a teenager would face a moment that would change everything, and not in the way he had hoped. His name was Elijah Carter, 17 years old, embarking on his first solo journey. Elijah's biggest dream was to sit in business class, and after weeks of part-time work and saving every penny, he finally had enough money to upgrade. As he settled into the spacious window seat, his heart raced. This was the first time in his life that Elijah felt truly different. Less than a few minutes later, that pride was quickly dashed. A flight attendant approached, a smile briefly flickering on her lips, but her eyes were icy. She leaned down to check Elijah's ticket, her gaze immediately turning suspicious as she looked up at his face. "Sorry, sir," she said, her voice light but firm. "You shouldn't be sitting here." Elijah turned his head and scanned the cabin. The other business class passengers were engrossed in their magazines or personal screens, none of them paying attention. "I upgraded," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I paid for this seat." The flight attendant, her name was Amanda Wilkes, remained stoic. "This seat is for fully paying customers. You don't belong here." Elijah froze. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What did you say?" His voice hardened. "I have a clear ticket. I was confirmed for the upgrade." Amanda didn't respond right away. She glanced over at a colleague, exchanging a look. After a moment, she turned back to him, her voice decisive. "I need you to move. There are plenty of empty seats behind." Elijah's heart pounded. His body stiffened under the pressure. It felt like everyone was watching, even though no one said a word. His hand clenched the armrest. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about how people saw and judged him. "Why?" Elijah asked, his voice trembling with anger and injustice. "I have a ticket. I haven't violated anything." Amanda sighed, as if losing patience. "I don't have time to explain. I'm just following the rules." A spark of determination flashed in Elijah's eyes. No, he wasn't going to let this slide like so many others. He knew someone who could help, someone the airline would have to listen to. Without hesitation, Elijah pulled out his phone, dialed the number he knew by heart, and put it to his ear. At first, Amanda didn't notice, but when she saw Elijah speaking seriously, her expression began to change. A brief flicker of tension passed over her face, but Elijah didn't care anymore. He had set the wheels in motion. The storm had begun, and soon enough, Everyone would see what happens when you judge someone based on a first impression. He gripped the phone tightly, listening to the ringing on the other end. His breath came quickly. Amanda's gaze remained fixed on him, now stiffening. He thought about everything he had gone through to get here. The long hours of part-time work, the sacrifices, the simple dream of being treated fairly. And now, it was all being trampled in this humiliating moment. Finally, a voice came from the other end. Short, strong. "Hello?" Elijah took a deep breath. "It's me, Elijah. I'm on a flight and need help." There was a brief pause. Then, the voice of the man on the other end spoke, cold and sharp. "What's going on?" The man's name was Marcus Hale, a highly influential figure and, more importantly, someone Elijah trusted completely. "I've been asked to leave business class. I paid for this seat. But the flight attendant, she says I don't deserve to be here." Marcus was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke, unfazed. "What flight? Which airline?" Elijah quickly provided the details. His anxiety rose. Could Marcus intervene in time? Could a single phone call change anything? Marcus spoke again, calm but heavy with authority. "You did the right thing calling me. Stay calm. Don't let anyone push you anywhere. I'll handle the rest." The call ended, but the storm had only just begun. Uncle Will make them listen. The call ended before Elijah had a chance to thank him. The phone screen went dark, reflecting his confused and anxious face. Even though he had called the right person, Elijah still couldn't be sure what would happen next. Everything was now out of his hands. All he knew was that Marcus Hale, the man he trusted, had influence, had a voice, and, most importantly, had the determination to never compromise when injustice occurred. While still holding the phone, Amanda Wilkes returned. Her eyes were colder than before. Elijah stood up, his spine straight as a rod. He was ready. There was no fear or embarrassment left. Not after everything he had been through. Not today. But before he could say a word, his phone vibrated again. A message appeared on the screen. "Marcus, I've made a few calls. Don't worry. Wait." Just a few words, but it felt like a wave of warmth rushed through Elijah. He lifted his head, his gaze calm. Amanda stood there, her expression showing clear discomfort. "Are you going to move?" she asked, her voice impatient. "Or should I call security?" Elijah looked her in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "No, I'm not moving. I haven't done anything wrong, and the person who's contacting your management will handle this. If you want to proceed, go ahead and call, but I'm not leaving this seat." His unexpected confidence made Amanda flinch. This time, her gaze swept across the cabin, as if weighing whether to push things further. But Elijah stood firm, as if the ground beneath him had turned to stone. Another vibration. The second message. "Marcus, done. They're removing her from the flight." Elijah read it in disbelief. As he was still processing the information, Amanda suddenly turned and walked quickly toward the back of the cabin. Soon, another crew member appeared, speaking urgently to her. Then, unexpectedly, like an unscripted scene from a movie, the plane jolted slightly. The seatbelt sign flashed on, and the captain's voice came over the PA. "We are experiencing a minor technical issue. The plane will return to the gate." Elijah held his breath. What was going on? The attendant started walking down the aisle, asking passengers to remain in their seats. Their faces were no longer the professional smiles they had before, but a sense of urgency. Elijah remained seated, his heart pounding. Though he still didn't know what was about to happen, he knew this was no longer just about him. Everything had moved beyond a seat. The plane rolled back to the gate. A strange feeling washed over Elijah. Not smugness, but a sense of relief mixed with determination. He had not given in. No matter what the outcome, he knew he was right. When the plane's wheels hit the runway, a small wave of murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers looked around, whispering to each other, trying to guess why the flight had to turn back. No one had a clear answer. The uncertainty made the atmosphere tense, like a string pulled to its limit. Elijah remained still, gripping his phone tightly. He didn't look around. He didn't need to explain. It wasn't the time. Marcus's message appeared on the screen again. They're removing her from the flight. What seemed impossible was now happening right before his eyes. The front cabin door opened. Footsteps echoed in the quiet space. 2 men in suits walked in. They weren't wearing flight crew uniforms. These were people from headquarters, management, the kind of people who only showed up when things were really serious. The man at the front walked up to the flight crew, exchanging a few brief words. The attendant's expressions immediately changed. One of them, who had kept her distance from the situation, quickly moved toward Elijah. No words, just a visible awkwardness in every step. Then one of the 2 men spoke, his voice clear and assured. "Sir, please come with us." Elijah looked up, a bit hesitant. Did I do something wrong?" The man shook his head, his voice calm. "No, you haven't done anything wrong. But we need to have a word with you." Elijah stood slowly. Each step felt like it was bringing him closer to a reality he hadn't fully anticipated. As he walked through the plane's door, things began to make more sense. Outside, in the area connected to the terminal, 2 more people were waiting, also in suits, also serious. A woman holding a tablet, her expression not stern but still not friendly. She looked like someone who had just inherited a crisis. She stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Monroe, the operations manager for North Glide Airlines. I need to have a word with you, if that's all right." Rachel Monroe led Elijah out of the aircraft's jet bridge and stopped in a separate area near the gate. Her face remained serious as she spoke. "We've been informed about an incident involving a crew member in your seat assignment. Is that correct?" Elijah nodded. "I was seated in business class. I have a valid confirmed ticket, but I was told I wasn't allowed to sit there." Rachel looked directly into his eyes. "Did you contact someone outside the airline?" "Yes," Elijah replied. She typed something on her tablet and let out a heavy sigh. "The person you called has contacted the senior management directly. That call went straight to the CEO's office." Elijah furrowed his brow. He knew Marcus Hale had influence, but he didn't realize the extent of his power. Rachel continued, her voice firm. "I want to make one thing clear. We take situations like this very seriously. If you were treated unfairly or there is evidence of discrimination, we will conduct a thorough investigation. But right now, we need to decide if the flight can proceed." Elijah frowned. "Because of me?" "No," she said. "Because of us. You didn't do anything wrong. But when something like this happens, and senior leadership is called during a flight, we have a mandatory process to stop all operations to resolve the situation." He turned back to look at the plane behind him. It still sat motionless at the gate. The passengers were still inside, likely whispering and guessing what was causing the delay. Rachel reviewed the information on her tablet and then said, "The flight has been temporarily suspended. The plane has been asked to return to the gate until the matter is resolved. The word suspended hit Elijah's ears like a heavy weight. He never thought things would escalate this far. He just wanted to keep the seat he had paid for. I didn't want things to go this far, Elijah said quietly. Rachel nodded. And that's the problem. You shouldn't have to fight for your rightful seat. We'll find out why this happened, and those responsible will be held accountable. A pause followed, as if everyone could feel the weight of the situation. Then, one of the two men in suits stepped forward. Do you have a few minutes? Someone wants to speak with you privately. Elijah nodded, still in shock. He was led down the airport corridor, where curious eyes began to follow him quietly. Each step felt like a move away from being just a regular passenger. They stopped in front of a quiet room, behind a frosted glass door. A man in a black suit was sitting inside, speaking softly into a phone. When he saw Elijah enter, he nodded slightly and ended the call. "Hello, Elijah. I'm Nathan Dorsey." The man introduced himself, shaking Elijah's hand. "I work directly with the senior management team at North Glide Airlines." Elijah sat down, feeling a bit tense. "Am I in trouble?" Nathan shook his head. "No, but the airline is." He paused for a moment, then continued. "Marcus Hale called. Not through customer service, not through the press. He called directly to the CEO's private line." Elijah was surprised. "Does that happen often?" Nathan shook his head. "Almost never. When something like this happens, it means someone in the system has made a major mistake." He took a document from a folder and pushed it toward Elijah. "This is your seat confirmation. Seat 3A, paid for, recorded in the system. No errors." Elijah nodded. I showed the flight attendant my ticket, but she didn't even look at it. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. "This isn't just a seat issue. This is prejudice. This is judgment. And we're investigating whether that judgment came from something personal." The atmosphere in the room grew tense. "I won't make any public announcements right now," Nathan said carefully, "but I have to be honest with you. You're not the first person to complain about that crew member. There's a pattern." Elijah's heart raced faster, so this wasn't just about him. Nathan stood up. "We'll make it right. You'll be rebooked, upgraded as before on another flight. We'll cover all costs. But more importantly, you've changed everything. And now, there are many eyes watching this." Elijah stood slowly. He couldn't smile yet, but for the first time since boarding the flight, he didn't feel alone. "What about my original flight?" he asked. Nathan nodded. "It's still suspended until further notice. The crew will be replaced. An official investigation has begun." Elijah didn't say anything else, but as he walked out of the leadership waiting room, he felt one thing clearly. Everything had just turned a new page. Uncle will make them listen. The call ended before Elijah had a chance to thank him. The phone screen faded to black, reflecting his bewildered and anxious face. Even though he had called the right person, Elijah couldn't be sure what would happen next. Everything had now gone beyond his control. All he knew was that Marcus Hale, the person he trusted, was someone with a voice, with influence, and, most importantly, someone who would never remain silent in the face of injustice. As Elijah continued to grip the phone tightly, Amanda Wilkes returned. Her gaze was colder than before. Elijah stood up, his spine straight as a rod. He was ready. No more fear, no more shame. Not after everything he had been through. Not today. But before he could say anything, his phone vibrated again. A message appeared on the screen. Marcus, I've made a few calls. Don't worry. Just wait. Just one line, but it felt like a warm breeze soothing Elijah's mind. He lifted his head, his gaze now calm. Amanda stood there, her face filled with confusion. "Are you going to leave your seat?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Or should I call security?" Elijah looked her straight in the eye, his voice calm but firm. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I haven't done anything wrong, and the person who is contacting your superiors will handle this. If you want to call anyone, go ahead, but I'll stay right here." Elijah's sudden confidence made Amanda flinch. Her gaze swept around the cabin, as if weighing whether to escalate things further. But Elijah remained motionless, as though the ground beneath his feet had turned to stone. Another vibration. The second message appeared. Marcus. Done. They're removing her from the flight. Elijah read it in disbelief. As he was still processing the news, Amanda suddenly turned and walked quickly toward the back of the cabin. Soon, another crew member appeared, speaking with her in an urgent tone. And then, like a scene out of an unscripted movie, the plane jolted slightly. The seatbelt sign lit up. The captain's voice came over the PA. "We are experiencing a minor technical issue. The plane will return to the gate." Elijah held his breath. What was going on? The attendant started walking down the aisle, asking passengers to remain seated. Their faces were no longer professional smiles, but tense expressions. Elijah remained still, his heart pounding. Though he didn't yet know what would happen, he knew one thing. This was no longer just about a seat. The plane turned back toward the gate. A strange sensation washed over Elijah. Not triumph, but a sense of relief mixed with determination. He hadn't backed down. No matter the outcome, he knew he had done the right thing. When the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, murmurs began to spread through the cabin. Passengers looked around, whispering to each other, trying to guess why the flight had to turn back. No one had a clear answer. The uncertainty made the atmosphere tense, like a string pulled taut. Elijah remained silent, still holding his phone tightly. He didn't look around. He didn't need to explain. It wasn't the time. Another message from Marcus appeared. "They're removing her from the flight." What seemed impossible was now becoming reality right before his eyes. The front cabin door opened. Footsteps echoed in the quiet space. 2 men in suits entered. They weren't wearing airline uniforms. These were people from headquarters, from management. The kind of people who only showed up when things were truly serious. The man at the front walked up to the flight crew, exchanging a few quick words. The attendants' faces immediately changed. One of them, the one who had stayed out of the situation, now hurried toward Elijah. No words, just a visible awkwardness in every step. One of the men spoke, his voice clear and steady. "Sir, please come with us." Elijah looked up, momentarily hesitant. Did I do something wrong?" The man shook his head, his voice calm. "No, you haven't done anything wrong, but we need to speak with you privately." Elijah stood up, each step feeling like it was drawing him closer to a reality he hadn't fully anticipated. As he walked out of the cabin, things started to make more sense. Outside, in the area connected to the terminal, 2 more people were waiting, also in suits, also serious. A woman holding a tablet, her expression neither cold nor friendly. She looked like someone trying to keep everything from falling apart amid a crisis. She stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Rachel Monroe. the operations supervisor at North Glide Airlines. I need to speak with you for a moment, if that's all right." As the plane left the runway, Elijah's story also left the terminal, and was now spreading everywhere. His phone was still in airplane mode, but he could feel clearly that what was unfolding outside, beyond this quiet cabin, could not be stopped just by a silent mode. The seat 1A Elijah occupied had no one next to it. It was like an invisible barrier separating him from the world around him. But, even in silence, he still felt the occasional glances aimed at him. Not judgment, not contempt, just awareness. An awareness that someone had just done something no one expected. The captain didn't mention anything special in the welcome announcement. No mention of the delay. Not a single hint about the fact that just hours earlier, the airline had turned the plane back because of a difficult truth to swallow. Elijah leaned back, his eyes on the cabin ceiling. The hum of the engine seemed to mask the tension in his chest. Because all that had happened was not just about an upgraded ticket, a seat. It was about the moment someone looked at him. Not at the ticket, not at the name or behavior, but looked at him, then decided he didn't belong. When the plane landed, Elijah turned his phone back on, and immediately a storm of notifications flooded in. The group chat with his friends exploded. "Bro, you're on the news. CNN's showing you. You're even in the headline." Elijah clicked on the link. The news popped up with a bold headline, "Teen asked to leave business class due to appearance. Airline suspends flight to investigate." Right underneath was the subtitle. A video filmed by a passenger was going viral. The airline had apologized mid-flight. The airport confirmed the incident, and North Glide Airlines' legal team confirmed that an internal investigation was underway. Just a few hours, but everything had begun to move. Then came a flurry of messages from unfamiliar numbers. "Hi, I'm Diana from the Morning Wave Show. We'd love to have you share your perspective. No editing, no frills. National talk shows want to hear from you. Do you want to speak out?" Elijah put his phone down. Just yesterday, he was a regular teenager, traveling solo. Now, the entire country seemed to be waiting to hear his version of the story. But one phrase kept running through his mind. Your side. No, there was no side, only the truth. And the truth was something many people still didn't want to admit, that it's still happening, all the time, everywhere. After collecting his luggage, Elijah was greeted by a man in a gray suit at the exit. No greeting, no smile, just a name tag and an envelope. "We've arranged private transport for you," he said. "An official letter will be sent to your home address. Once again, on behalf of the company, we apologize." Elijah got into the car but didn't accept the silence. He opened the envelope he had been holding. The letter was written in standard corporate language. An apology, an acknowledgement of the service failure, a commitment to diversity, fairness, and inclusion. But not a word mentioned prejudice. No phrase dared to mention wrong judgment. It all danced around, as if afraid to call out the real issue. There was only one line that made Elijah stop. "We will use this incident to retrain our team to help them better understand the values the company stands for." Elijah folded the letter. This wasn't about values on paper. This was about a moment where someone had the chance to do the right thing, but didn't. 2 days later, Elijah agreed to do an interview, not for fame, not for praise, but because if his name had to be tied to this moment, at least he wanted to tell it his way. The studio was small, neat. The host was a woman speaking gently with a respectful gaze, and she asked the right questions. What made you decide not to leave your seat when she asked you to? Elijah didn't hesitate. Because I paid for that seat. I have the right to sit there. If I stood up, it would mean I was telling myself she was right, that I didn't belong there. She nodded. Did you think this would go as far as it did? I wasn't trying to become famous, Elijah said. I just didn't move. She paused, looking down at her notes, then looked up. There are many young people who've gone through moments like this, but in silence. What do you want them to learn from this? For the first time during the interview, Elijah looked straight into the camera. His voice was certain. You don't have to yell to be heard. You don't have to be angry to be right. You just need to know who you are, and don't let other people's discomfort make you doubt that. The interview aired that evening. Within hours, millions of views flooded in. Comments followed one after another. This kid is more composed than many adults. His last line gave me chills. And as the video spread, something else quietly happened. Others began to share their own stories. A wave of stories began to spread. Videos, articles, images, not only related to North Glide Airlines, but from all walks of life. Moments when people were treated differently, moved from their seats, ignored, doubted. A movement was rising, and it showed no signs of stopping. That night, Elijah received another message. Internal leak. The flight attendant is being evaluated for termination. A new policy is being drafted. But Elijah didn't post anything online. He didn't participate in any more talk shows. He didn't need to do anything more, because the story was no longer just his. It had become a mirror that many people were now forced to look into, and this time no one could look away. The wave didn't calm down. In fact, it grew stronger as more people came forward to share their own stories. Elijah never wanted to be at the center of attention. But it was his calm and resolve that opened up a space for dialogue that no scripted apology or press release could close. His name appeared everywhere, on social media, podcasts, news bulletins, panel discussions. Even people who didn't know the full story started mentioning Elijah as a symbol of resilience, of silent protest, of changing a system without needing to shout. But while the world outside was focused on the headlines, Elijah was still living in the present. School, homework, friends, and the strange feeling of how people now looked at him differently. Some saw him as a celebrity, others avoided him, unsure of what to say. One afternoon, after school, a teacher called him over. I just wanted to say, I watched your interview. The way you handled the situation, that's real courage. Elijah nodded. Thank you, sir. Have you thought about what you're going to do next? The teacher asked. Elijah shrugged. I didn't plan for any of this. The teacher smiled. Sometimes the most important things come to us when we least expect them. That night, Elijah opened an email he had overlooked earlier in the day. It was from the airline's new communications department. The tone was different. No more cliches, no more avoidance. We understand that our previous communication may have been inappropriate. We would like to invite you to a private discussion with the airline's leadership. No cameras, no recordings, just a conversation. Your experience could help us shape future passenger policies. Elijah read it twice. He wasn't naive. He knew that meetings like these could just be a crisis management tactic. But it could also be a real opportunity to prevent this from happening to someone else. The meeting took place the following week. Not in a fancy conference room, no photographers, just a simple room, a long table, a few leaders, and a tense, silent atmosphere. Elijah spoke, without anger, without bitterness, just the truth. I didn't shout. I wasn't rebellious. I just sat in the seat I paid for. And that was enough to be doubted. One leader nodded slowly. We've seen the video. We've spoken with the crew. What happened doesn't reflect the values of our airline. Elijah responded immediately. Then your values need to be clearer, because your employees don't just act on instinct, they act on what they think is normal, and that's the problem. A silence followed. Then another person asked, "If you were in our position, what would you change?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. He truly thought about it, because if this wasn't just a procedural apology, it needed to be backed by real action. "Start with retraining," he said. "Not the superficial kind of training, but real education. Bring in people who understand what unconscious bias looks like, when it's not loud, when it hides beneath the guise of procedures and rules." He saw them taking notes. "And there needs to be accountability," Elijah continued. "If someone crosses a line, don't wait until a video goes viral to take action." He leaned forward. "And don't make passengers prove they deserve to be there. That's not their job. It's yours, to treat them as if they've belonged there from the start." The room was silent, but it was a silence that listened, a silence that thought. After the meeting, Elijah was offered a position as an advisor, not in a token way, but to actually participate in a new youth advisory board for the company's internal diversity program. He said he'd think about it, not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to make sure it wasn't just a checkbox in a PR plan. Back at school, things continued to change. A group of students started a new initiative about bias in public spaces, about being heard without having to raise your voice. They invited Elijah to speak at an all-school assembly. He said, "I'm not great at speaking in front of crowds." They replied, "You don't need to be great. You just need to be honest." And so, Elijah stepped onto the stage in front of hundreds of students. His voice was calm, his message simple. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't require loud speeches. No hashtags, just sitting still when someone tells you to stand up. Doing the right thing isn't always loud. It doesn't need hashtags. It doesn't need banners. Sometimes it's just sitting still when someone tells you to stand up. As Elijah finished speaking, the entire auditorium fell silent. No applause immediately followed. But it was that silence, deep, thick, and sincere, that spoke more than any applause ever could. And so, what began with a single moment on a flight had grown into something much larger. Elijah was no longer just the kid who refused to leave his seat. He had become the person who made others start asking, why did this happen in the first place? 2 weeks later, North Glide Airlines announced an updated policy: mandatory training for all staff on unconscious bias, establishment of a bias response team, implementation of new business class procedures eliminating subjective judgment when reviewing passengers. All of this didn't come from an argument. It didn't come from a loud protest. It came from Elijah simply sitting still, refusing to leave the seat he had paid for. But there was still one call Elijah hadn't made. One conversation that he knew, sooner or later, he would have to face. Not with the media, not with the board, but with the one who had quietly watched everything unfold from a distance: his father. the man who had made a single phone call that led to the suspension of the flight, not with anger, but with influence, calmness, and the ability to know exactly when to step in. Elijah didn't avoid the call. It's just that call held so much, because no matter what the press wrote, no matter how social media praised him, there was only one person, his father, whose reaction mattered the most to Elijah. His father didn't remain silent. He just chose to quietly observe, a silence from someone who had lived through it all. "I'm here. I'm watching. I'll let you walk, but I'm not going anywhere." That call, the one that caused the plane to turn around, no one knew the exact content. No passengers heard it. No flight attendants dared to ask. No press release ever disclosed it, because it wasn't meant to draw attention. It was power used precisely and with limits. When Elijah finally pressed dial, it wasn't to thank him. It was to talk, to really talk. His father picked up after 2 rings. "I figured you'd call," he said, his voice calm. "I've been thinking a lot," Elijah began. "And I have too," his father replied. A pause. Not awkward, just both giving each other space to feel. Finally, Elijah spoke. "I know I did the right thing, but why did you do it that way?" His father didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Because there's a difference between making noise and making an impact. You did the first part very well. I just made sure the second part happened too." Elijah fell silent. "I didn't even know you were watching." "I'm always watching," he said softly. "I don't intervene, unless it's really necessary." But when she put her hand on your shoulder, when she asked you to leave as if you didn't belong there, that stopped being about you. It became about how the world views kids like you, even when they're calm, when they're right, but still seen as wrong. Elijah swallowed. His father's words seemed to settle in his throat. "You weren't wrong for staying," he continued. "And I wasn't wrong for calling, to make them understand who they were dealing with." Elijah smiled lightly. "So, who were they dealing with?" His father chuckled softly. "Someone they'd rather not piss off. Not arrogance, just the truth." Elijah's father, his name was Theodore Carter, had built his career on influence. Not the kind that gets praised on TV, but the kind that happens in advisory boards, helping to shape policies, guiding important conversations behind closed doors. When he called North Glide, he didn't threaten to sue, didn't need to name drop, didn't need to raise his voice. He simply made it clear, "My son paid for that seat. You removed him from that cabin not because of policy, but because of bias. You're holding the wrong plane, and unless you want this story told by someone with a much louder microphone, you'd better start by admitting that right now." And that was it. And everything started shifting before Elijah even made it to the gate. But Elijah wasn't just grateful. He was curious. "Did you know it would go this far?" "I knew it could," his father replied. "But I also knew this isn't my story. That's why I stepped back. You didn't need me to speak for you. You just needed the space to be heard. And you did that, better than anyone else could." That moment made Elijah choke up. His father, a man always calm, always steady, was now looking at him not as a child needing protection, but as a young person who had just changed the entire conversation with his poise, composure, and courage. "You didn't shout, you didn't get angry, you just stayed with your truth," his father said, "and sometimes that's what makes the whole system shake." They continued talking about the future, about what should come next, not just with the airline, but with Elijah, because now he was being invited to workshops, Schools wanted him to mentor younger students. Reporters were constantly asking for exclusive interviews. And amid all that, Elijah still held one big question. How do you move forward without being swallowed by your own story? Several companies started sending invitations. Some offered scholarships, others extended internship opportunities. But Elijah wasn't sure which ones were genuine and which ones were just a result of a viral story. "I don't want to become a brand," he said to his father. Theodore Carter smiled gently. "Then don't. Be a voice. Speak when you truly have something to say, not when people expect you to say something." That phrase stayed with Elijah, gently, but profoundly. In the days that followed, Northglide Airlines launched a new campaign. No flashiness, no fanfare, just a focus on responsibility. They publicly released an internal report, statistics on complaints, broken down by category. They created an anonymous feedback portal for passengers. There were no images of Elijah, no press conferences, no pre-recorded clips, just clear and verifiable policy changes. Meanwhile, Elijah returned to school, returned to his homework, returned to everyday life. But now, all of those things carried the aftershocks of a tremor that had passed. Some days, everything felt distant, like it had never happened. But on other days, the weight of representation pressed heavily on his shoulders, because becoming a symbol was the strangest thing, especially when he never asked to become one. One evening, while sitting in his room, scrolling through a few small articles, Elijah stopped at a headline from a local newspaper in a different state. "Teen kicked out of business class inspires local airline to change policy." It wasn't big news. It didn't cause a social media storm. But the airline cited Elijah's case as the reason they were reassessing their training processes. And in that moment, Elijah realized something profound. This was no longer a story about an airline, nor was it about a single flight. It was about the silent waves spreading far and wide, from one act of dignity, sitting still, not backing down, and refusing to be pushed around. But there was still one thing that wasn't closed. One person Elijah hadn't heard from since that day. Amanda Wilkes, the woman who had started it all, with just one prejudiced glance, one misplaced request, and one irreversible decision. And this time, it was she who took the initiative to reach out. The message didn't come through social media. It didn't come through public channels. It was an email sent to Elijah's school account, forwarded by an administrative staff member who didn't know what to do with it. Subject line, "I need to say this." Elijah knew exactly who it was, even before opening the email. Her name was clearly there. No hiding behind legal teams, no pseudonyms. Just her words, direct and unshielded. He hesitated before reading, not because he was afraid, but because all the memories were still there. The feeling of being humiliated in front of the entire cabin, the whispers, and the silence that followed the words, "You don't belong here." Even so, Elijah clicked. "I don't know if this email will reach you. I don't know if I deserve to send this. But I'm writing because I owe you something I didn't give you on that flight. The truth." Each word seemed to have been written after many sleepless nights. No lawyer's language, no defensive excuses in the apology. Just a person facing their own mistake. "I saw you sitting there, and I assumed you shouldn't be there. Not because of your clothes, not because of your seat number, not because of how you spoke. It was me. It was my bias. It was my failure." Elijah read that line 3 times. There was no but. No phrase like "I didn't mean to." Just the truth. I've been in this job for 16 years. I've flown all routes. I've met all kinds of passengers. I used to think I was fair. I used to think I was trained enough to see people objectively. But I was wrong. And you showed me that, without shouting, without protesting, in the way I thought I would act if the situation were reversed. She went on to describe what had happened afterward. Being suspended, starting therapy, enrolling in classes, not because the airline required it, but because she realized that what I did wasn't just wrong, it was lazy, and lazy thinking harms. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't demand a response. She just asked one thing. Please don't let my mistake define who you are. And please keep showing everyone that standing still can be a way to stand tall. Elijah didn't know what his feelings were at that moment. It wasn't exactly closure, but it was real. A person who had wronged him, and now trying to take responsibility in silence. He thought for hours. He typed and deleted at least 6 different responses. Finally, he wrote, "I've heard you, and I hope others hear it too." It wasn't comfort. It didn't make the mistake lighter. But he allowed her words to exist, because that's what he had hoped for. Not punishment, not a stage, but the space to be seen as a full person. The apology couldn't erase what had happened, but it had changed the atmosphere surrounding the story. Because when someone takes responsibility without being forced, it carries weight that no press release could ever generate. In the weeks that followed, things began to change. Not only in how Northglide Airlines handled the situation internally, but also in school, the media, and even among strangers when they talked about Elijah. The story was no longer just about injustice. It had become proof that calmness could also be a form of strength, that control could resonate louder than anger, that dignity, when maintained, could move entire systems without needing to break them. One morning, Elijah was invited to speak at a national student leadership forum. He almost declined, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't want to be forever associated with the image of the boy on that flight. But then, something inside him shifted. It wasn't a desire for fame, nor was it due to pressure. It was just clarity. When he stepped up to the podium, Elijah didn't mention the flight, at least not directly. He began with a different story. Many people think strength lies in what you say, but I've learned that strength sometimes lies in what you don't say. When you choose not to shout, when you don't fall apart, when you refuse to play the role others try to shove you into. That's when you become the hardest to ignore. The entire room fell silent, because they understood. No one had to say it aloud, they all knew. Elijah wasn't just telling a story, he was teaching them how to write their own. When he stepped off the stage, an older teacher approached him, with silver hair, a soft voice. "I was on that flight," he said. Elijah froze. "You were there?" "I saw everything. I wanted to speak up, but I stayed silent. I've thought about it every day since then. And I just want to say, what you did, it really mattered." Those words hit Elijah hard, not because they were praise, but because they were proof. Proof that silence can also be a wave, but not one that always drowns. Sometimes it's just waiting, listening, learning. And when there's enough courage to speak, it rings out louder than the first drops. And that wave was still spreading far. A few days later, Elijah received a call, not from the press, not from the airline, but from the U.S. Department of Transportation. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, We would like to invite you to a private meeting with representatives from the Civil Rights Division. Would you be willing?" At first, Elijah didn't understand the gravity of it, until his mother, Camille Carter, put the phone down and said, "They don't call unless they're really paying attention." And they were paying attention. When Elijah arrived at the federal headquarters, he didn't walk in like someone seeking justice. He walked in knowing exactly why he was there. Not for the spotlight, not for retribution. Just to ask one simple thing: how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And they listened. Every word. No one interrupted as Elijah recounted everything. The suspicion surrounding his ticket. The flight attendant's gaze, which wasn't just checking, but judging. How his calm response was considered suspicious. And how the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if he would get angry. But Elijah made it clear. This was no longer about a single flight. It was about spaces where some people are always treated as outsiders. About having to constantly prove that you have the right to exist. About how young people like Elijah are coached from a young age to speak quieter, walk slower, just to avoid being seen as a threat. When he finished, a representative in the room spoke. "We've encountered similar situations, but rarely has it been told with such clarity and calmness. Usually, everything ends in chaos. But you made it something else. They didn't ask Elijah to be their spokesperson. They didn't ask him to join a media campaign. They asked, would you be willing to help us develop a training standard, something practical, applicable for airline staff? A program that didn't just focus on cultural sensitivity, but one that actually addressed responsibility, recognizing bias and tackling the system that silently nurtured it. Elijah agreed, not immediately, but after careful consideration, because if his story had to be used, then he would be the one to tell it, on his own terms. He joined a task force of real experts, civil rights activists, airline representatives, Department of Transportation officials, and even former flight attendants who had been discriminated against. Together, they created a completely new training program, one that didn't start with guilt trips but with data, the truth, videos, personal stories. The new training program began with the truth. Stories, videos, evidence. It didn't scream. It didn't try to make anyone feel guilty. It simply pointed out one thing. Bias isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in a neat uniform and a polite smile. And then, the program showed the audience what happens when someone refuses to shrink in the face of that injustice. This training program was approved for trial in the 5 largest airlines in the United States, and North Glide Airlines, the same airline involved in Elijah's incident, voluntarily adopted it. Not because they feared a lawsuit, but because they saw their own blind spots, and for the first time, they stopped pretending those blind spots didn't exist. Back at home, life continued. School, friends, applications for programs Elijah once thought he'd never qualify for. But one clear change had occurred. The way people talked about him had shifted. Elijah was no longer the boy kicked out of business class. He was the one who made an entire flight turn around, and then rebuilt the runway from the wreckage. Of course, there were critics. People said he should just let it go. Some even said, "You're lucky to even be in business class. What more do you want?" But Elijah didn't respond. It wasn't necessary. Because every time he stepped onto an airplane, no matter the airline, no matter the route, he knew something had changed. Not because the world had suddenly become perfect, but because now, if another kid walked into business class, They wouldn't be questioned before even sitting down. And if they were asked, there were now procedures, policies, systems, because one quiet teenager had stayed still long enough for an entire nation to stand up and listen. It all culminated in a national panel, where Elijah was invited to speak. Attendees included civil rights activists, transportation leaders, airline CEOs, and even the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. At the end of the forum, the moderator turned to Elijah and asked, "Would you like to add anything?" Elijah scanned the room. The lights dimmed. All eyes were on him. And then he spoke. "My goal was never to become a symbol. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. So, if your system only works for the loudest, the wealthiest, or those who look like they belong there, then that's not a system. That's a mirror. And it's time to change what's reflected in that mirror." Applause began, softly at first. Then it grew stronger. And soon the entire room was on their feet, not because of drama, but because of the truth. A truth that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. And at the back of the room, a familiar face quietly stood, Amanda Wilkes. No uniform, no badge, just a woman learning how to see the truth. And that, more than anything, showed that this journey was having an impact. Because change doesn't begin with laws. It begins when people stop denying what's broken. The following months weren't filled with flashy headlines, no viral clips, no sensational news. But they were filled with change. Slowly, steadily. At airports across the country, conversations began replacing silence. Ticket agents started pausing before questioning a first-class ticket. Flight crews started reassessing judgments they once thought were instinctual. And passengers, especially those who had never been asked, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" began to realize that those invisible boundaries had always existed. Elijah didn't chase the spotlight, though it continued to follow him. Interviews, panel discussions, college invitations. People called him brave, exceptional, even a hero. But Elijah just said, "I'm just telling the truth." And I didn't move. He graduated high school in quiet, on time, with solid grades. A few teachers nodded gently with proud eyes, because they knew Elijah had made an impact far greater than many could in decades. He received a scholarship to college, not because of his story, but because of the way he carried that story, like a weight, but never using it to crush anyone, only to lift what had been knocked down. He chose a college that didn't require him to retell the old story. They only asked, "What can we learn from you?" And they let him help other young people lead with composure. But the journey didn't stop there. By the time Elijah turned 20, he had helped draft a new set of national guidelines, approved by major airline associations. Not just general rules about non-discrimination, but policies requiring airlines to track complaints by race, age, and class, and investigate patterns of bias that had previously been ignored. At the same time, Elijah co-founded a mentorship program for young people of color who wanted to pursue careers in aviation, not just to be passengers, but to become pilots, engineers, policy advisors, even flight attendants. "Don't just board the plane," Elijah said. "Be the one flying it. Be the one designing it. Be the one rewriting the manual." And they did. Elijah's story was no longer just a chapter in a debate. It became a spark that lit classrooms, conference rooms, cockpits. It wasn't an email, nor was it a social media message. It was a handwritten letter, sent by a very young boy who had been following Elijah's journey from afar, a boy who had once been pulled aside at the airport just for playing music too loudly and laughing too much. In the letter, the boy wrote, "I used to be afraid of flying, not because of the height, but because I didn't know what could happen to me up there. Then I read your story. And now, I know that if one day they tell me to stand up, I don't have to shout. I just need to sit still, because I know I have the right to be there." Elijah folded the letter slowly, gently, as if folding a piece of a precious memory. He slipped it behind his notebook, the journal he had started keeping since everything began. Not to record the pain, but to track the progress. The notebook grew thicker over time, not because of the wounds, but because of the small victories. Sometimes it was just a flight attendant catching themselves before making a hasty judgment. Sometimes it was a black family being allowed into business class without being scrutinized. And sometimes it was airlines publicly releasing progress data every year, not to create a spectacle, but to see how far they had come, and how far they still had to go. Elijah had become an irreversible part of something much larger. One action, holding a seat. But that action didn't just make a plane turn around. It made an entire industry, one used to hovering above the clouds, land on the solid ground of truth. He didn't choose anger. He chose the truth. And by standing still, he had made the entire system move. Years later, at a quiet airport, Elijah sat alone, headphones loosely hanging around his neck, backpack resting on the floor, his first-class ticket in his hand. No one stared. No one whispered. No one checked his ticket a second time. When the boarding gate opened, Elijah stepped in first. Not because he was special, but because that seat, from the very beginning, had always been his. And finally, the world had caught up to realize that. Elijah didn't do anything extraordinary. He didn't stand on a podium to preach. He didn't go on air to become a star. He simply told the truth. And he didn't leave his seat. But that very act changed the way the world saw an airline ticket. A small action, sitting still in the place he deserved, reached the law, industry training, and even the hearts of those who had never dared to speak up. And, as Elijah once said, sometimes doing the right thing isn't loud. It doesn't have a hashtag. It's just sitting still when someone tells you to stand up. What about you? Have you ever had to prove you belong somewhere? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you find this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos, where emotions speak and people are heard.